My daughter and her husband returned from their celebratory trip to China smiling. They walked up the stone path to the front door of the house they had just sold for $3 million. A house they were convinced was theirs. My son-in-law Kevin slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. It turned smoothly. But the moment he pushed the door open, the smiles vanished from their faces. What they found inside made my daughter Alicia let out a scream. It was a sound I hadn't heard since she was a little girl who'd fallen from a swing set. A sound of pure, unfiltered horror. But they weren't screaming because of what was there. They were screaming because of what was not. Before I tell you what they saw in that vast empty space and how I orchestrated it all from my armchair with a phone and a fountain pen, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And please hit like and subscribe if you believe a man's legacy is something worth fighting for. That scream was the final note in a symphony of whispers that had been playing in my home for 2 years. It began right after Lena, my wife of 50 years, passed on. The silence in this big house on the hill was deafening. So when Alicia and Kevin suggested they move in to help take care of me, a part of me felt a profound sense of relief. I thought it was a blessing. I soon learned it was the beginning of a siege. At first, the changes were small. Alicia came into the kitchen one morning and said, "Dad, these old floral curtains are so dated. I saw some lovely minimalist ones online." Before I could answer, they were ordered. Lena had picked out that floral pattern. She said it made the kitchen feel like it was always spring. A week later, Kevin decided my favorite leather armchair, the one perfectly molded to my body after decades of use, was an eyesore. He moved it to the basement without asking. "It just ruins the flow of the living room, Jed," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as if we were partners in the decision. Slowly, piece by piece, the house began to feel less like mine, less like ours. It felt like a hotel where I was a long-term resident whose preferences were politely ignored. Alicia, my own flesh and blood, seemed to shrink in her husband's presence. She would start to say something catch Kevin's eye, and her thought would just trail off into a hesitant smile. They were a team, and I was slowly realizing I wasn't on it. I was the project, the problem to be managed. The whispers grew louder. Kevin's voice carried from the porch at night while he was on the phone. "It's a prime piece of real estate. Gentrification is pushing values through the roof. An asset just sitting here." He never spoke of it as a home. It was always an asset, a number on a spreadsheet. My life's work reduced to a Zillow estimate. Then the gentle suggestions started, each one a small needle probing for weakness. It began with the garden. I was out back turning the soil in Lena's rose beds, my hands deep in the earth where I felt closest to her. Kevin came out holding a tablet. "Jed, you really shouldn't be out here digging in the dirt at your age. What if you fell? No one would know." He said it with a tone of deep concern, but his eyes were on the size of the yard, calculating its square footage. He wasn't worried about my health. He was worried about his investment. A few weeks later, it was my car keys. I was heading out for my weekly breakfast with some old friends from the union. Kevin stopped me at the door. "Hey, where are you headed?" he asked, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. I told him. He nodded slowly. "You know, I was reading an article about reaction times in drivers over 70. It's pretty scary stuff. Why don't I hold on to these for you? I can drive you anywhere you need to go, just for safety." He held out his hand, not as a request, but as a demand. I looked at my daughter, who was standing in the kitchen pretending to be busy with the coffee maker. She wouldn't look at me. In that moment, I felt the walls of my own home closing in. I gave him the keys. I didn't want to cause a fight. I now understand that avoiding a fight was the most dangerous thing I could have done. The talk about money became constant. Kevin would sit at the dinner table scrolling through his phone. "Did you see what the Henderson place down the street sold for $3.2 million? Jed, this isn't just a house, it's a portfolio." He spoke as if I were a child who didn't understand the value of things. I, who had started a construction company with nothing but a pickup truck and 2 strong hands. I, who had personally drafted the blueprints for this very house. I would just nod and continue eating the food tasteless in my mouth. Each comment was a small act of erasure, an attempt to chip away at my competence to make me a frail old man who needed saving from himself. They weren't just taking over my house, they were trying to take over my identity. Some nights when the house was quiet and they were asleep, I would walk through the rooms alone. I'd run my hand along the oak banister I installed myself. I'd stand in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room where Lena and I had marked our children's heights in faint pencil lines. You could still see them if you caught the light just right. This house was a living record of our life together. It was built with the overtime pay from my first big contract, every brick a testament to a promise I made to Lena when we were just kids with nothing. I told her I would build her a castle, a place so solid no storm could ever shake it, a place where our family would always be safe. I would stand there in the dark, the faint scent of Lena's lavender polish still clinging to the wood, and I'd feel her presence. I'd remember her laughter echoing in the hall. I'd remember the day Alicia took her first steps on this very floor. The house wasn't an asset, it was a sanctuary, it was a promise. And as I listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, I knew, deep in my bones, that I was not just fighting for a piece of property. I was fighting for the soul of my family. I was fighting to keep my promise to Lena. They saw a price tag. I saw my entire life. And I knew I would have to make a choice. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. It was an ordinary evening. We were sitting at the dinner table, the one Lena had bought at an antique store and spent a whole summer refinishing. Kevin had opened a bottle of expensive wine, something he did when he was about to make a move. He cleared his throat after taking a long sip. "Jed," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Alicia and I have been talking. We're worried about you, and we've been thinking about the future, about how to best protect everything." He gestured vaguely around the room. "We think it's time we formalize things. For your protection, of course. We should look into getting me power of attorney, and maybe we can set up a new trust, something more modern that I can manage for you. It would take all the stress off your shoulders." The air grew thick and heavy. I looked at Alicia. She was staring intently at her plate, pushing a piece of chicken around with her fork. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She was a willing accomplice in her own father's dispossession. I put down my silverware, the clink echoing in the sudden silence. I looked directly at Kevin, this man who saw my life's work as a line item in his portfolio, this man who saw me as an obstacle to be managed. I let the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of his own audacity. Then I gave him my answer. It was a single word delivered with a calm I didn't know I possessed. No. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, piercing the comfortable quiet of my study. I was reading a book on urban architecture, a passion of mine since my early days on job sites. I saw Alicia's picture on the screen and felt a familiar mix of hope and weariness. I answered. "Hey, Dad," she said. Her voice was bright, a little too loud, like a radio host trying to sound cheerful. "Just calling to check in on you. How are you feeling today?" I looked out the window at the oak tree Lena and I planted on our first anniversary. Its leaves were starting to turn gold. "I'm fine, Alicia. Just reading." "Oh, good. That's good," she said quickly. There was a pause where a real conversation might have started. Instead, she filled it with a checklist. "Did you take your blood pressure medication this morning? Are you remembering to eat lunch?" "Yes, Alicia, I remembered." "Okay, great. Great," she said, her voice trailing off. "Well, I have to run. Kevin's just got home. Just wanted to hear your voice. I'll talk to you soon. Bye, Dad." The line went quiet. The call was like a stone skipping across a deep lake. All surface, no depth. I sighed, about to put the phone down on the table. But before I could, the silence was broken. Alicia hadn't hung up the phone. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the receiver feeling suddenly cold against my skin. The silence on the other end was a vacuum, a hollow space left by a conversation that meant nothing. I was about to set the phone down when the vacuum was filled. It was my son-in-law Kevin's voice. It was not loud or angry. It was worse. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of warmth, like a doctor discussing a patient he'd never met. "Is he off good?" Kevin said. There was the sound of a chair creaking. "Look, honey, I know this is difficult, but you heard him on the phone. He's just going through the motions. He sounds tired. Did he even ask you a single question about yourself?" Alicia's voice was faint, thin, and tangled with a guilt I could almost taste. He didn't have a chance, Kevin. I was in a rush." "That's not the point," Kevin said, his tone patient, like he was explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. "The point is, we can't keep doing this. We're putting our lives on hold. You're stressed, I'm stressed. And for what? So he can wander around this big empty house, forgetting if he took his pills." "But a nursing home." Alicia whispered the words as if saying them louder would make them more real. "It feels so cruel." Then came Kevin's final clinical argument. the words that would echo in my mind for months. It's not cruel, Alicia, it's practical. Sunnyside Meadows is a highly rated facility. He'll have nurses' activities people his own age. We can't give him that. And let's be brutally honest here. We are sitting in a $3 million asset. We can't start our future, we can't invest, we can't travel until we unlock that value. He has to go to a nursing home. It's the only logical solution. We sell the house, use a small portion to fund his care indefinitely, and we finally get to live. It's the right thing to do. For everyone. There was a long, heavy sigh from my daughter's end of the line. It was the sound of a final surrender. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Kevin. I finally heard the click of the phone disconnecting. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier this time, filled with the words I was never meant to hear. I stood frozen in the middle of my study, the phone still in my hand, feeling its weight as if it were a block of lead. My breath caught in my chest. It wasn't the anger that hit me first. It was a deep, profound cold, a sorrow that seemed to seep into my bones, making them ache. My daughter, my Alicia. She had agreed to dispose of me as if I were a piece of old, inconvenient furniture. I slowly lowered myself into the armchair by the window, my legs suddenly feeling unsteady. The world outside seemed distant, blurry. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the last photograph I have of Lena. It was from our 50th anniversary, just a few months before she got sick. Her smile in that picture had always been my comfort, my safe harbor. Now looking at it, another memory surfaced, sharp and painful. It was from her final days in the quiet, sterile room at the hospital. The air smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Alicia was holding her mother's hand, her face streaked with tears. Lena, with what little strength she had left, had looked at our daughter and whispered, "Take care of your father, baby girl. He's a strong man, but he's going to need you." And Alicia, my daughter, had squeezed her hand and promised, "I will, Mama. I promise I will always take care of him." That promise echoed in the silent study, a ghost laughing at my foolishness. The cold sorrow in my chest didn't go away, but something else began to form within it. It was hard and clear, like ice forming on a winter lake. The pain was still there, but it was no longer just a weakness. It was becoming a foundation. I was not just some old man to be managed. I was Jeremiah Wallace. I was the keeper of Lena's memory. I was the builder of this house and this life, and they thought they could just erase me. A quiet resolve settled over me, calm and absolute. This was not about revenge. This was about justice. This was about honoring a promise my daughter had forgotten. My hand stopped shaking. I looked down at the phone, no longer a source of pain, but now a tool. I unlocked the screen, scrolled through my contacts, and my thumb stopped on a name I hadn't called in over a year. Marcus Thorne. I didn't press call. Not yet. I just looked at his name. The architect in me began to stir. It was time to draw up a new set of plans. The morning after the phone call, I woke up before the sun. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but it was no longer a fog. It was a whetstone, and on it I was sharpening my mind. If they wanted a frail, forgetful old man, then that is exactly what I would give them. My career was spent building structures designed to last for a century. Now, my final project would be to construct a fiction, a character so believable it would lead my own daughter to a truth she could not escape. The performance began at breakfast. I sat at the table, my hand trembling ever so slightly as I reached for my coffee. Kevin was reading the financial news on his tablet, and Alicia was listlessly stirring her yogurt. I picked up my spoon to eat my oatmeal, and just as it neared my mouth, I let my fingers go limp. The spoon clattered onto the tile floor. Alicia let out a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Dad, be careful." Kevin didn't even look up from his screen. He just smirked. I looked down at the spoon, my face a mask of confusion and embarrassment. "Oh," I mumbled. "Silly me. It just slipped." Kevin glanced at Alicia with a look that said, "See, this is what I'm talking about." They saw a symptom. I saw the first brick being laid in my new foundation. Later that afternoon, I found Kevin on the back porch looking out at the yard. I walked over to him, leaning on the railing. "Looks like we might get some rain," I said, squinting at the perfectly clear blue sky. He gave me a strange look. "The forecast says sun all week, Jed." I nodded slowly as if processing the information. An hour passed. I found him again in the living room. I walked in and looked out the same window. "Sky's looking a bit gray," I said to him, my voice uncertain. "Think it might rain." Kevin put down his phone and looked at me with an air of profound patience that was more insulting than any anger. "Jed, we just talked about this. It's not going to rain." He spoke slowly, loudly. I just shook my head as if to clear it. Right. Sorry, son. My mind is all over the place today." Each repeated question was another stone I placed on the scales, weighing down their certainty, making their cruel plan seem not just logical but compassionate. The mail became a daily theater piece. Kevin would bring it in and sort through it. One day he handed me an envelope. The water bill. I stared at it, turning it over in my hands. I held it upside down. "What's this for?" I asked, my brow furrowed. I, a man who once managed the payroll and procurement for a 50-man construction crew, was now pretending not to recognize a utility bill. Kevin sighed and pulled up a chair. His condescension was a thick blanket. "This is the water bill, Jed. It means we have to pay the city for the water we use in the showers, the sinks." He pointed to the amount due as if I'd never seen numbers before. I let him explain it to me for 5 full minutes. His patronizing tone was the fuel that kept my engine running. In the evenings, I perfected the art of drifting off. I'd sit in my armchair with a book, and soon my head would nod. My breathing would become deep and slow, and the book would slip from my lap to the floor with a soft thud. In those moments, they spoke freely, believing I was lost to the world. "He's exhausted," Kevin would whisper to Alicia. "He can't even get through a chapter. We're doing the right thing, honey. This is too much for him." And my daughter, my own Alicia, would agree. Every word they spoke was another nail in a coffin they were building. They just didn't realize it wasn't for me. The next morning, I told Kevin I was feeling tired and was going to spend the day in my room. He nodded, a satisfied look on his face. The moment they left the house to go shopping, I walked 2 miles to a convenience store and bought a cheap prepaid phone with cash. My first call was to Marcus Thorne. I hadn't needed a lawyer in years, but I had a feeling I was about to need the best. More than that, I needed a friend I could trust with my life. Marcus Thorne and I go back 55 years. We met in the mud of boot camp, 2 young men trying to prove we were tough enough. We served together, came home together, and he was the best man at my wedding to Lena. He held me up at her funeral. He was the only person on earth besides my children who knew the full story of what Lena and I had built. I told him to meet me at a small coffee shop on the other side of town, a place with worn-out vinyl booths and coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, a place my daughter and her husband wouldn't be caught dead in. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a back booth. At 76, Marcus was still sharp as a tack, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look more like a CEO than a semi-retired lawyer. His eyes, however, were the same. They didn't miss a thing. He stood up and embraced me. "Jed, you old dog, it's been too long. What's so urgent it couldn't be a phone call to my office?" I slid into the booth across from him. I didn't waste time. I told him everything. I started with the little things, the whispers, the moved furniture, the car keys. I told him about Kevin's obsession with the house's market value. And then I told him about the phone call. I repeated the words Kevin and Alicia had said, my voice flat and emotionless, like I was reading a weather report. As I spoke, I watched the emotions shift across my friend's face. First there was confusion, then a dawning horror. By the time I finished, his jaw was tight and his eyes had a cold fire in them I hadn't seen since we were young men in a foreign land. He was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped on the table. He didn't offer pity. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He said something much better. "That ungrateful, slick son of a gun. I never liked him, Jed. I told you that at their wedding." A wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't just some crazy old man. My anger was justified. It was shared. Then Marcus took a deep breath and his entire demeanor changed. The angry friend receded and the lawyer took his place. He sat up straighter, his eyes becoming focused, analytical. He pulled a leather-bound notepad and a pen from his jacket pocket. "Okay, Jed," he said, his voice now crisp and professional. "Let's go to war. They want to treat you like you're incompetent, fine. We'll use that. But first things first. We need to check our fortifications. Tell me about the house. Whose name is on the deed? Is there a trust? I need to know exactly what the battlefield looks like." I leaned forward, a spark of my old self, the builder, the planner, returning to me. "That's why I called you Marcus. Lena and I were always planners. There's a trust. The Wallace family trust." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. "Oh, is there now?" he said softly. "Well, well, well. They think they're playing checkers with a tired old man. Jed, my friend, we're about to teach them how to play chess." Marcus leaned forward, the faint smile still on his lips. He steepled his fingers, looking less like a lawyer and more like a professor about to explain a fundamental law of physics. "Jed, Lena was a brilliant woman. You both were. When you set up the Wallace Family Trust all those years ago, you didn't just build a wall to protect your assets. You built a fortress." He picked up a sugar packet from the dispenser on the table. "Think of the house like this sugar packet," he said, holding it up. "Most people just own their house outright. It's in their pocket. Anyone can try to pickpocket them. But you and Lena, you put the house inside a locked steel box. That box is the trust." He placed the sugar packet on the table and put his coffee cup over it. "When you created the box, you made yourselves the only two people with the keys. You were the trustees. When my dear Lena passed, God rest her soul, her key didn't vanish. Legally, it was passed to you. So now, Jed, you are the sole trustee. You are the only person on this planet who holds the key to that box. You have the exclusive, absolute legal right to do whatever you want with what's inside." I nodded, remembering the long nights Lena and I spent with our first lawyer, making sure every word was right. She was always the planner. "A belt and suspenders, Jed," she used to say. "Always be prepared." Her voice seemed to echo in that little coffee shop. She was still protecting me. "Now," Marcus continued, his voice dropping slightly, "Alicia is a beneficiary of the trust. This is the part your slick son-in-law, Mr. Financial Advisor, got wrong. He's an amateur playing in the big leagues. He saw her name on a document and his eyes turned into dollar signs. He assumed beneficiary meant owner. But it doesn't. It means she's entitled to benefit from what's inside the box, but only at the discretion of the person holding the key. She can live in the house, but she cannot sell it. She cannot borrow against it. She cannot do anything without your signature. She has no key." He leaned back, letting it sink in. "Any sale they try to conduct is a ghost. It's a fantasy written on paper that isn't worth the ink. It's fraud. They are attempting to sell something they have absolutely no legal title to." Then he leaned forward again and his eyes gleamed. "But here is the beautiful part, my friend. While they are busy selling a ghost house to a ghost buyer, you, the man with the only key, can quietly and legally sell the real house to a real buyer. We will conduct a legitimate ironclad sale right under their noses. They are so busy planning your eviction that they won't even notice when the ground beneath their feet is sold." The weeks that followed became a strange two-act play performed on the same stage. In one act, my daughter and her husband were the stars of a glittering comedy of their own making. In the other, Marcus and I were quietly setting the stage for the final, inevitable tragedy. While I continued my performance as a man fading into the twilight, my real work began. I would hear them in the kitchen, their voices buzzing with an energy I hadn't heard in years. They would spread stacks of official-looking documents on the table, Kevin pointing at signature lines with an air of immense self-importance. He was on the phone constantly using terms like due diligence and closing escrow with a confidence that only the truly ignorant can possess. "It's a done deal," I heard him tell someone. "The buyer is a private investment group. They're paying cash, no inspection needed." I knew, of course, that the investment group was likely a shell company he'd created himself. He wasn't selling a house. He was performing a magic trick, trying to pull $3 million out of a hat that didn't belong to him. Alicia was consumed with a different kind of planning. Travel brochures for China were scattered among the legal papers. "First-class tickets, Kevin. We've earned it," she'd say, her eyes shining. "And a suite overlooking the Great Wall." I would hear their laughter from my room as I sat in my armchair reading. They sounded like children on Christmas morning, absolutely certain they had been good all year. Their joy was a hollow sound, an echo in a house that was already beginning to feel like a tomb for their integrity. Meanwhile, my own meetings took place in a different world entirely. Marcus and I didn't meet in kitchens filled with false hope. We met in a quiet wood-paneled boardroom downtown. We sat across a long mahogany table from the directors of the West Side Community Heritage Trust. They weren't slick investors. They were historians, architects, and community elders. The head of the trust was a woman named Eleanor Dubois, a retired professor with eyes that held the wisdom of generations. She didn't speak of the house in terms of square footage or market value. She spoke of its soul. "Mr. Wallace, she said to me during our first meeting, her voice resonating with deep respect. What you and Lena built on that hill is more than a house. It's a landmark. It's one of the first custom-built homes by a Black-owned construction firm in this city. It's a cornerstone of this neighborhood's history. We are not interested in flipping it. We are interested in preserving it. They showed me blueprints and plans to have the house declared a historic site, ensuring it could never be torn down. They wanted to create a scholarship in Lena's name for young architects from the community. One Tuesday afternoon, Kevin and Alicia held their own signing ceremony. They popped a bottle of cheap champagne at the kitchen table and toasted each other. "To our future," Kevin said, raising his glass. "To us." They were giddy with success. I watched from the doorway, leaning on the frame for effect, and offered them a weak, confused smile. They thought I was witnessing their triumph. The following Friday, I had my own signing. There was no champagne, just a quiet room, a notary public, and Mrs. Dubois. Marcus slid the documents in front of me. I picked up the heavy fountain pen Lena had given me for my 40th birthday. As my hand moved across the page, signing away the house we had built, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt a sense of profound peace. I was not liquidating an asset. I was cementing a legacy. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of support. That evening, they sat me down in the living room. "Dad, we have wonderful news," Alicia said, barely containing her excitement. "We did it. The house is sold. We got a fantastic price. Now we can finally find you a wonderful, safe new place where you'll be taken care of." Kevin added, "And to celebrate, we've booked a trip. We're going to China for 2 weeks. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It will give us plenty of time to get everything sorted out for your move when we get back." They looked at me expecting a smile, a thank you. I just nodded slowly. "That sounds nice," I said, my voice deliberately frail. "You two have fun." They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. An uninterrupted 2-week window to dismantle their fantasy piece by piece. The day the movers came was quiet. I sat in my armchair, the last piece of furniture to be loaded, and watched them work. They were professionals, wrapping my life in blankets and boxing it up with quiet efficiency. Alicia and Kevin were already in China, sending occasional photos of themselves smiling in front of temples. They had no idea that back home their entire world was being dismantled. When the last box was on the truck and my armchair was lifted away, I was left standing alone in the cavernous silence of my own life's museum. The truck pulled away and I was alone. The house had never felt so large. Every sound I made, the scuff of my shoes on the hardwood floor, the soft rustle of my jacket, echoed in the emptiness. I began my final tour, a silent goodbye to the life Lena and I had built within these walls. I walked into the kitchen and stood where our table had been for 47 years. I could almost see Lena there, humming as she rolled out dough for a pie. I could almost hear the chatter of a young Alicia telling us about her day at school. A house is not just wood and nails. It is a silent witness. I ran my hand along the cool plaster of the hallway wall. The paint was bare, but my memory supplied what my eyes could not see. I could feel the phantom pencil marks where we measured Alicia's height year after year until she finally surpassed her mother. "Look, Jed, she's a giant," Lena had laughed. All those years we were celebrating her growth, never imagining she would one day try to cut me down to size. I ended my tour in our bedroom, looking out the large window at the old oak tree in the backyard. From this window I had watched my daughter learn to ride a bike. I had watched that oak tree grow from a sapling into a giant that stood guard over our home. I was giving up the view, but not the memory. There was a profound sadness in that moment, but no regret. To save a thing, sometimes you must let it go. I was not losing a house. I was ensuring its story would be told correctly. I was giving it a new guardian, one that would honor its past in a way my own daughter could not. This was the price of protecting my promise to Lena. I walked to the front door for the last time. I did not look back. I pulled the heavy oak door shut, and the sound of the latch clicking into place was the most final sound I had ever heard. The fortress was now secure. I sat in the armchair in my new apartment, the one that used to be an eyesore in my old living room. Outside the large window, the city lights were beginning to sparkle against the deep blue of twilight. A cup of chamomile tea rested on the table beside me. I was calm. My phone buzzed with a notification from the airline app. Their flight from Shanghai had landed an hour ago. At that very moment, I knew they were in a taxi slicing through the evening traffic heading home. I could picture the scene so clearly, it was as if I were a ghost sitting in the back seat with them. Alicia would be leaning her head against the cool glass of the window, tired from the long flight but buzzing with a restless energy. She'd have that dreamy look in her eyes she used to get as a child thinking about her birthday. Kevin would be on his phone, of course, probably checking his bank account for the 10th time. "I can't believe it's real," Alicia would say, her voice a happy sigh. "China was a dream, but I'm so ready to start our actual life." Kevin wouldn't look up from his phone, but a smug smile would be playing on his lips. "The wire transfer should have cleared while we were in the air. $3 million, baby. Liquid. I told you the plan was solid. I told you I'd handle it." He would finally look at her. "So have you decided on the color for your new convertible?" Their conversation would be a fantasy shopping list. A boat for him. A new house for them, something modern with a lot of glass and a gated community on the other side of town. They would talk about investments and portfolios. At some point, a flicker of guilt might cross my daughter's face. "I feel a little bad for Dad," she might say softly. And Kevin, ever the pragmatist, would wave it away. "Don't. We did what was best for him. He's safe, his care is funded, and we are secure. He wouldn't have known what to do with all that equity anyway. It was just sitting there rotting. We're the smart ones, Alicia. We maximize the asset." I imagine those were his exact words. Maximize the asset. He was right in a way. They were smart, they had a plan, they had lawyers and documents, but they had built their entire future on a single faulty assumption. They had read the map upside down. And now they were arriving at their destination. The taxi would turn onto the familiar tree-lined street. And there it would be, my old house, standing on the hill, waiting for them like a prize at the end of a race they didn't realize they had already lost. "Look," Alicia would say, a smile in her voice. "We're home." I imagine the taxi pulling away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing down the street, leaving them alone in the quiet evening. There would be a moment of stillness, the two of them standing on the sidewalk looking up at the house. Their prize. Kevin, with a swagger in his step, would jingle the single key in his hand. Alicia would be smiling, a tired but deeply satisfied smile. They had done it. They had won. I can see them walking up the familiar stone path. Kevin would be the one to go to the door, the conqueror returning to his castle. He would select the key. I can almost hear the small metallic scrape as he pushed it into the lock. He would turn his head and give Alicia a confident wink before turning the key, and the lock would turn. A solid, satisfying click. A familiar sound. The sound of a key opening a lock it was designed for. The sound of ownership, or so he thought. That small detail was a courtesy from Marcus. He wanted them to have that one final moment of absolute certainty before the floor fell out from under them. Kevin would push the heavy oak door inward, expecting the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books. He would expect to see the warm glow of the lamp on the entryway table. He would expect the comfort of home. Instead, the door swung open into a cavern of echoing silence. The house was a hollow shell. The evening light from the large windows sliced through the empty space, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air where their lives used to be. There were pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung for decades. The hardwood floors, once covered with rugs and furniture, were now vast, naked expanses of wood that amplified the sound of their own breathing. Kevin's confident smile didn't just vanish. It froze, then crumbled. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to clear a faulty image from his eyes. His first thought, I'm sure, was that they had been robbed. "What the hell?" he would whisper, the sound swallowed by the emptiness. Alicia would be standing on the doorstep, one hand still holding her luggage, the other flying to her mouth. Her eyes would dart from one empty space to another. The living room to the left, where the sofa and my armchair should have been. The dining room to the right, where the long mahogany table was gone. It wasn't the chaos of a robbery. This was something else. It was an absence. It was a deliberate, perfect, and terrifying void. Kevin would take a hesitant step inside his expensive shoes, making a loud, lonely sound on the bare floor. He'd turn in a slow circle, his mind refusing to process the scene. Nothing. It was all gone. Absolutely everything. They stood there on the threshold, caught between the world they thought they had built and the stark reality I had prepared for them. The silence in that empty house was louder than any alarm, and it was just the beginning. Their eyes, accustomed to the dim light, would have scanned the vast, empty floor, and they would have seen it. A single plain white envelope placed perfectly in the center of the entryway. It would have looked impossibly small in the great emptiness of the room, yet it would have commanded all their attention. It was not a piece of mail. It was a statement. I imagine it was Alicia who moved first, her steps hesitant, drawn toward the envelope as if by an invisible string. Kevin would have stayed behind, rooted to the spot, his mind still trying to form a rational explanation for the empty rooms. A colossal, moving mistake. A prank. His brain would be rejecting the impossible truth. Alicia's hand would be trembling as she knelt down to pick it up. The paper would feel cold in her hands. There was no name on the outside. She would tear it open with a fumbling uncertainty. Inside, a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. She would begin to read it aloud, her voice small and shaky, a child's voice lost in a very large, very empty room. This property, she'd begin, was sold on September 5th to the West Side Community Heritage Trust. The first blow. Kevin would snatch the paper from her hand, his eyes scanning the words, his face a mask of disbelief. What? No, that's impossible. This is a joke. He can't do this. Alicia would continue as if from memory, the words now branded in her mind. Your personal belongings have been moved to storage unit number 247 at Secure Space Storage on Elm Street. The first 12 months have been paid in full. The second blow. The cold, practical detail that made it undeniably real. This was not a joke. This was a plan. Kevin's face would begin to turn red, a tide of fury rising against the rocks of his disbelief. I have paperwork. I have a buyer. I'll sue him. I'll ruin that senile old fool. He would pull out his phone, his thumb jabbing at the screen, trying to call a lawyer who wouldn't answer, trying to stop a tidal wave that had already crashed. Alicia's voice would be a whisper now as she finished the note's final lines. This key will cease to function at midnight. This was not your house to sell. It was my wife's legacy to protect. The final blow. The reason. The verdict. Kevin would let out a guttural roar of pure, impotent rage. He might kick the wall, the hollow boom echoing through the house, the only result a scuff mark on his expensive shoe and a sharp pain in his foot. He would be yelling about lawyers and judges and theft, but his words would be meaningless, just noise thrown against the silent, unyielding walls of my victory. But Alicia would not be angry. She would understand. She knew me. In that moment, she would see the entire 2-year chess game laid bare, and she would finally realize that she had been a pawn from the very beginning. She would look at the pale rectangles on the walls where her childhood photos used to hang. She would look at her husband, a raging stranger in the ruins of their future. She would look at the piece of paper that had dismantled her entire life. And then she would open her mouth. It would start as a gasp, a fight for air in a room where all the oxygen had been sucked out. And it would build into a scream. It was not a scream of anger or frustration. It was the sound of a soul breaking. It was the sound of consequence arriving right on schedule. While a storm of their own making was breaking over my daughter and son-in-law, my world was perfectly calm. There was no echo of a scream in my new apartment, only the gentle hiss of hot water pouring from a kettle into my favorite ceramic mug. I stood at a large window that overlooked the city, a sprawling galaxy of lights that glittered against the dark velvet of the night sky. Down below, the traffic moved in silent flowing rivers of red and white. This new space was smaller than my old home. It was clean, modern, and uncluttered. It was mine. For the first time in 2 years, I could breathe without feeling the weight of unspoken words and resentful glances. The air in this small apartment was my own. The silence here was not the heavy silence of a family falling apart, but the clean, quiet peace of a job well done. I was not happy. The feeling that settled over me was not the giddy triumph of a victor. It was a solemn peace, a profound sense of rightness. It was the quiet relief of a storm that had finally broken, a storm I had to summon myself in order to clear the air for good. I had not acted out of a desire for revenge. I had acted to restore a balance that had been deliberately and cruelly upended. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I did not have to imagine their panic, their rage, or their tears. I had already accounted for them. They were simply the final predictable variables in a long and painful equation. Their chaos was the price of my peace. And as I looked out at the city, a world of possibilities stretching out before me, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my soul that the price was worth it. Their screaming was just the first echo of a building collapsing. A house built on a lie cannot stand, and Kevin's entire plan was a house of cards built in a hurricane. I imagine him right now frantically calling his lawyer, yelling about his rights and his paperwork. But the pieces of paper he holds are worthless. They are props in a play, and the play is now over. Here is what they will soon discover in a series of cold, hard meetings with people who do not care about their feelings. To get their $3 million, Kevin didn't just pretend to sell the house. He had his ghost company, his private investor, take out a very real mortgage from a very real bank using my house as collateral. This is a serious crime. It's called bank fraud. The bank, believing the sale was legitimate, wired that $3 million to them, the sellers. That was the money they used for their first-class tickets to China. Now the ghost buyer will not be making any mortgage payments. The bank will come to collect its collateral. They will try to foreclose on the property. But when they do, they will not find Kevin and Alicia. They will find the West Side Community Heritage Trust holding an ironclad, legally executed title. They will find that their multi-million-dollar loan was secured with an asset that the borrower never owned. The bank will not simply forgive and forget. They will turn their full attention and the full weight of their legal team to the people who signed the papers and received the money. The $3 million they thought was their key to a new life is now a colossal debt that must be repaid immediately. And when the bank is finished with them, the district attorney's office will likely begin its own investigation. I did not have to push them off the cliff. I just had to step aside and watch them run towards the edge with their eyes closed, blinded by their own greed. I did not set a trap for them. I simply allowed the trap they set for me and for themselves to finally spring shut. They were so busy trying to steal my future, they never stopped to secure their own. The call came a week later. I was watering a new plant on my balcony when her name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering, but I knew I had to. This was the last piece of the old structure that needed to be brought down before I could truly build anew. I answered and said nothing. On the other end, there was only the sound of ragged, difficult breathing, then a sob. "Dad?" Alicia's voice was broken, a shattered thing I barely recognized. "Dad, I am so sorry. Kevin. He told me it was the only way. He said you weren't safe. I was so stupid, Dad. So weak. We've lost everything. The bank. They're taking everything. I'm so sorry." She dissolved into tears, a torrent of regret and self-pity. I listened. I let the silence stretch, let her feel the full weight of the space she had created between us. I did not yell. I did not say, "I told you so." When her sobbing finally subsided into small, hitched breaths, I spoke, my voice calm and even. "I hear you, Alicia." Another silence. I could feel her waiting for more, for forgiveness, for a solution. I offered neither. "The man you and your husband tried to put in a home is gone." I continued, my words measured and clear. "The father whose unconditional love you treated like a bank account is gone. If we are ever to have a relationship again, it will be a new one. It will be built from the ground up on a foundation of honesty, and it will start with respect." "I do respect you, Dad," she whispered desperately. "No, Alicia." I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You don't. But you can learn. Respect is not something you can inherit or demand. It must be earned. The road ahead of you is long and difficult. Whether it leads back in my direction is entirely up to you and the choices you make from this day forward. Goodbye, Alicia." I ended the call before she could reply. I put the phone down, not with anger, but with a sad finality. The door to our old life was now locked. If she wanted to build a new one, she would have to find the tools herself. In the end, I had to give the house away to truly save it. It sounds like a contradiction, I know. I could have left my daughter a fortune in property, a $3 million inheritance. Instead, I hope I've left her with something far more valuable, the costly, painful lesson of consequence. It is a lesson she will spend years, perhaps the rest of her life, trying to understand. A true legacy is not something you can sell or have appraised. It is not written in a will. It is written in your actions. It's the quiet dignity you refuse to surrender. It is the honor you live by and the respect you command, not with your money, but with your character. They tried to take my home, but in doing so, they forced me to remember what my real home was built on. It was built on the foundation of my own self-worth. I sold a house, but I reclaimed my life. I am 75 years old and I am building again. This time on a foundation no one can ever take from me. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that the greatest betrayals often come not from enemies, but from family who take love for granted. It teaches us that a person's worth is not measured by their age or perceived weakness, but by their character and resilience. When pushed to the brink, quiet wisdom and meticulous planning are far more formidable weapons than loud emotional reactions. It underscores a crucial truth. Respect is the non-negotiable foundation of any relationship, and when it is broken, the entire structure is destined to collapse under the weight of its own greed. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.